The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. I am Tylor, and as always, I am joined by Greg. Greg, what did you think about the chapters this week? It was nice to finally be out of the two rivers.
They were great chapters, and I'm excited to unpack them a lot with you. I would say the view from 30,000 feet. The first one kind of was snail's pace, and then the second one was like, oh, we're just jumping a week, like we're doing a lot at once. So it was an interesting combination. You know, we didn't really plot this out to get good pairings, but sometimes it works out that way. How's life with you? How are things going?
Things are good. I am done with the tenure push, and so I can now devote all of my time to the Wheel of Time, as it obviously should be. Now, I know we wanted today to not start by diving into the next chapter and doing a quick discussion. We are going to introduce something that we're going to try out for a few episodes. Let us know if you think it works. Let us know if you think there are additions that would be helpful. And I am going to allow Greg to introduce this segment for the first time because I didn't write down its name.
So I tentatively titled this segment an inadvisable discussion about a visual object in a purely audio medium, which is our way of saying we want to talk a little bit about some of the materials around the different chapters, both in the book and in the history of the book. And so what that necessarily will mean is if we're really on top of our game, you can find in the show notes a link to this image we're about to discuss, or else you'll just have to Google it based on what the discussion comes out of from this. So we're going to try this for a few weeks and just see how things are going. In the real world, we are now launching the podcast, so we will be able to get your feedback very soon. So we welcome that when the time comes. But I'm going to throw it to you, Tylor, to introduce this particular discussion and this piece of art we're going to be looking at.
Yeah, so we are actually 1 week late on this week's artwork. Typically, my goal is going to be to try to discuss maybe a chapter icon or a cover that is something that is depicting the work that we're actually reading. So today, what I wanted to talk about was the original cover for The Eye of the World, the one that most of you are probably most familiar with if you're looking for like the classic cover from the Wheel of Time. And so this is the painting by Daryl K. Sweet. If you Google The Eye of the World cover, it's the one that's going to pop up. It's blue. It's got people on horses. It's gorgeous. But I think it's also really interesting because for a long time, I think this was the painting that kind of cemented people's ideas of who these characters were and what they look like. And now in the television show era, we also know this isn't the only way to depict those characters. And so it's this really interesting tension for me as a longtime reader who also really enjoys the show to see this is like a classic work. It's one of the first pieces of art that really made me fall in love with the Wheel of Time. And we talked about how important covers were for me personally getting involved in this series. But it's also something that, you know, kind of clashes with now the way that I view a lot of the events that are actually taking place here. So before I dive too much into themes or anything else, Greg, that was my deep dive. I know too much about this perspective. I'd love to hear. I know when I sent you this image, the only thing you said in response, we normally don't talk much Wheel of Time outside of the podcast, but you just said, oh, I know this. And so I'm curious what your experience with this cover was or what your thoughts were upon saying, hey, let's spend 5 minutes chatting about this picture.
Yeah, it is a really interesting question. Like, why is this familiar? And, you know, I assume when we're talking about obviously a well-beloved book, that just my years in libraries and bookstores, and maybe particularly used bookstores, you end up seeing this over time. And it is an interesting cover because it does feel of a time and yet out of time somehow, right? It's like,
Yeah.
oh, it's that kind of pure fantasy art that is not exactly an identifiable artist, at least to me. It kind of looks like the Hildebrandt brothers, who did some Star Wars and some Lord of the Rings famous art over time. Obviously, a different artist, but it reminds me of those times. And there was a period where I think a cover like this is what drew people into fantasy.
Yeah.
And I'm going to say this perhaps a little cruelly. I think as fantasy got seen as cooler, you deferred to something like what my trade paperback, or excuse me, my what's the opposite of a trade paperback?
A mass market paperback.
Yeah.
You are the one who is married to a bookseller. I just
I know.
want to point
She's
out.
upstairs, like stomping on the ceiling, like, no, what are you doing? My mass market paperback is, very plain. And it has kind of iconography instead of a rendering of the characters. And mine does have the beautiful, soon to be an original series on Prime Video kind of sticker, which may explain part of why they go towards that. So yeah, but I would much prefer what you have here, or what I have to. When I was growing up, I had a friend who only read movie novelizations. So my wife and I refer to them as Mark books, which is when a movie comes out and you get the edition with the actor on the cover or a still image from it. So I don't know that I've seen those for Wheel of Time. Maybe they're exclusively on Amazon. Or...
Yeah, I have actually only seen one of them, and it was The Eye of the World. I think it's really interesting trying to make covers for anything too far beyond that, because the TV show hasn't covered it. So I don't know whether they're planning to wait until they have images that would work, or what they're planning on doing. But I've only seen it for book one.
So the other thing I'll say, and use this as my toss to you, is, to me, as I look at this image, the most prominent figure out of all those, or where my eye goes, is the pony, right? Which that's not the pony you're attached to, or is it?
It is not. I believe the two prominent horses. So the pony, I think, is Eldieb. So that would be Moraine's horse, which now we know the name of in this chapter. We planned it perfectly right. This is when we should have had this discussion. But yeah, I think that's the one that you're right. It stands out. And she's sitting side saddle, which is interesting because A, she doesn't do that in the book. And B, she's sitting side saddle in a way that turns her away from the painter, the eye of the image. And that's, I think, really interesting choice by the painter, right? That's not how Moraine is described in the book, so he must be doing something there.
Yeah, it must be how his model posed or something like that. I wonder, but right. Or I was also thinking, like, a woman in a skirt sitting side saddle. That sounds hard. I would just tuck it behind the horse as well and just draw or paint an ornate saddle in its stead.
That's fair. And I think this is one thing that I actually generally don't prefer. The Daryl Sweet covers. The same artist painted all of the covers 1 through 13, and then actually passed away while working on a draft of the 14th, because that's what happens to all of the artists who worked with this series, apparently. That's a little dark, my bad. But I've never been super enamored of the Daryl Sweet paintings as covers, not because I don't love them as art. I think they work. They're what attracted me to the series. I think they're really great figures. My issue has always been that I never feel like the covers really kind of capture the spirit of the scenes, or capture the spirit of the kind of characters in the way that I'm looking for. Like you're saying, they're really great kind of classic fantasy covers, but that's not exactly what the Wheel of Time is, right? It's not just classic fantasy. It threw some really interesting wrenches into the works, and you don't see much of that flair or that character in these images. And I think that the biggest example of that is in this image, right? We see really large in the image are Lan and Moraine. And then we get kind of a little bit of Rand off in the corner, the main character who everything is from his perspective. And then all of the other protagonists are off on the back cover if you've got the traditional like wraparound of this image. And so it's very odd to me. It always seems like these covers are really great images. And then I'm like, but wait a minute, why are you focusing on that character in this moment? Right? Because this image we're talking about it looks kind of like them going, I don't know whether it's Watch Hill or arriving at Taren Ferry, or, you know, it's kind of in that like fleeing down the road sequence that we talked about in the previous episode. But they picked the characters who aren't the protagonists to be big front and center on the book cover. And I think that often happens in ways that kind of take the focus on what I really love about the series.
Well, and I will say, again, I'm not an expert necessarily on details I read, but in my mind, I think of Moraine as looming larger than the rest of them because she's the one with the power. And I don't think of her. I mean, here she almost looks childlike, right? That she's so much smaller than Lan. Lan seems giant, and it's curious as I look more closely at his armor looks like Eastern, right? It's like a samurai armor. The swords look more traditional European medieval, but I certainly don't know the name of this, but the decoration on the helmet that sticks up, it's kind of U-shaped or horseshoe shaped.
There is a name for that, and I will remember it the next time we play Dungeons and Dragons. It's gone from my memory right now.
Yeah, but I, again, my, Western culture bias, that's certainly not the armor my mind goes to when you think of a knight in armor or what have you. But then probably reading too much into it, it's like, well, you've hinted that this is our world, and is it in the far future when all of this culture is one or mixed in some ways? Perhaps that's some piece of this. I imagine though that this was probably painted when the first book came out, before all Revelations came into being.
Yeah, that's accurate, right? This was painted, Robert Jordan, I believe, I don't know whether he had finished the second book, but he had made significant progress on the second book by the time the first one came out. But even then, I think he probably would have dictated to the artist something like, well, this is a world where, a lot of the armor and the weapons are Eastern inspired. And in fact, I think a good example of that we've talked about is Rand's father's sword, which we talked about. The description feels a lot more like a katana or a curved blade than the traditional European straight blade. So it's interesting that kind of comes through, at least, even though a lot of the other flavor doesn't.
And then it's just the moon, right? I mean, like a good fantasy book. It makes me think of Dwight's shirt on The Office with the wolves howling at the moon. It has that kind of van art kind of imagery, and I certainly don't mean that derisively, even though I think it can only be taken derisively.
I think once we hit van art, we have reached the end of neither of us being at all experts in art on our non-visual medium. Was there anything else you wanted to mention here, Greg? Or I just wanted to make sure we get a chance to acknowledge the wonderful art associated with this series.
Yeah, I think you're right to say, even though this is a visual medium, people can Google, and it's good to just celebrate the entirety of the world. And I as a literature professor, I often get asked, like, somebody says like, oh, I've always wanted to read War and Peace, or I've always wanted to read Moby Dick. What's your advice? And I have a few like real tips, but one of the tips I always give is actually go find an edition that looks really cool. Because if you're slogging your way through a really thick book that you're not sure you want to be reading, like, have a cover that excites you, or the splayed pages always get me excited. And like, I'll spend a couple extra dollars to get a really cool edition of the last one I did this on was Brothers Karamazov. I'm like, I got to read this. I want to learn what I got to know my Russian literature better, basically. And so I got a really cool cover instead of just the boring Penguin Classics that was the cheapest. So I'm all for it, and I'm glad that's a part of your fandom of this book series and can draw people in. But let's waste no more time. Let's now talk about the actual book itself. So we are today covering chapter 12 and chapter 13. This would be Across the Taren and Choices. I will pitch it to you with your summary of Across the Taren.
All right. So in Across the Taren, we begin kind of where we left off, fleeing into the city of Taren Ferry, and Lan has just asked the ferryman to go and gather his haulers. We're going to make our way across the ferry. And basically the initial part of the scene is Lan recognizing that the ferryman might be willing to rob them, might be willing to try to intimidate them or cheat them. And so he gets all of the Two Rivers folks to kind of look intimidating. My favorite moment in all of this is Tom flourishing his dagger and then immediately using it to trim his nails, which is just very Tom. Eventually, they start to make their way across the river. It becomes clear that the ferryman was kind of potentially up to something nefarious and is now a bit upset at not having an opportunity to, do whatever he was planning to do. They make it across the way. Moraine diffuses another potential situation by offering silver to all of the haulers so that it's not just the boss who's getting paid, it's them. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, there is a whirlpool. The ferry sinks, and Moraine basically apologizes, hands over some gold, and says, let's get moving. Once they eventually make their way out, we realize that Moraine has set the fog along the river rather than further inland. And then we get to see this scene with Moraine teaching Egwene something about the power, and we learn a little bit more about saidin, saidar, and the different types of the power that are being used. And so this is actually something that I kind of wanted to throw to you about, is this is our first kind of big exposition dump, as opposed to a lot of places the world building has been really integrated. Did it feel very different for you, or how did this chapter land compared to some of the others that we've talked about?
Actually, both chapters tonight felt like they had this big chunk of exposition and world building, and it was a little bit tough. So let me dodge the question for only a moment to say the very first thing I wrote down was in a page or so of the opening. It was a quote from the book. There must be a difference in what you saw, it seemed to him, depending on whether you sought adventure or had it forced on you. There is the motto of our podcast right there. One of us sought this adventure and the other had it forced on us. So that's why I don't see all the details you see. Just made me laugh. Of course, I don't mean that directly, but
no, forced is a good word.
So the two of these chapters, each of them felt like a lot. And I think to me, it is harder when it's like action, pause, here's a whole bunch of information. I mean, funnily enough, this is when Game of Thrones patented the sex position, right? Like we'll just have some naked people on screen while we go through the details. And I mean that's what I'm looking for. Like, why weren't there pictures in the book? No, but in all seriousness, like I think it's tough, especially for me in fantasy, and I think a lot of people experience this when it's a lot of new words and vocabulary. And when they are similar, which there's a little bit of stuff like that here. But that is the struggle I'm currently having in my other fantasy book I'm reading. Is there's like a kookaroo and a kookarah, and I like half the time forget which is which, and they're not actually called that, but something like that. And I'll read a scene and I'll be like, that was that lieutenant, and then I'll be like, oh no, that was the priest. The lieutenant has an A in the middle. So yeah.
and I'll actually be the first to admit, when I originally read this series, I don't know if it was because I was studying German, where it's like der is the masculine, or whether it was just because of whatever linguistic biases I had in my head. I could not believe that saidar was not the male side. Like my brain just could not accept it for 2-3 years. I would always get them backwards. And so these words are not only super similar, but they, at least in my brain, I don't know whether this is an English linguistic thing or, like I said, something I picked up elsewhere, but the way that my brain initially assigns gender to those two sounds just sounded flipped to me for years.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And, obviously, well, we have basically skipped the first chunk of the chapter. We can maybe dodge back if we have things to say about that part, but
they rode some horses. It was fine.
Yeah. What is interesting is obviously balance continues to be a major theme here, and the image comes to mind of the yin yang without the dots, the cover of my journal you've given me,
and the black and white cookie,
so the saidin and the saidar, the saidin being the male and the darkness. Right?
Yes. The only thing, just because I think this is how they're pronouncing it in the show, it's saidin, not
saidin.
Din.
Okay. Yeah. Din and saidar.
Dar, yes.
Dar.
And this is me, I have to say this as someone who's read the stupid glossaries. technically, I think it is supposed to be 2 syllables. It is Sai rather than Sai, but just say it fast. It's Sai, whatever.
Okay, I see what you're saying. And so, it was interesting me in this moment where we are getting this kind of dump that to understand the religious side of what's been going on. We've understood more of the political as time has gone on in the geography, if nothing else.
Yeah.
And so I think, as I understood the kind of the point of this scene is to really remind us, or to really actually introduce to us, that Egwene has the power, has a true, they say, a true source of this power. And it's in the next chapter, she kind of talks about her misgivings about the two sides and all that. But I will say that's what surprised me the most, because I thought it was very clear we were doing a chosen one narrative for Rand. And then this chapter is like, oh, no, actually, she's the one that matters. Now, I think it's both, right? Like, it's not that she replaced him, but it was so much of the narrative had us focused on his mysterious origins, his, specialness, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
And so that suddenly it's like, oh no, it's her. And I'm gonna apologize if I'm mixing up the chapters. There's also the hint here that there was another woman in the village who also had it. Kari.
Yes.
Is that the next chapter? I think that's
I believe that's the next chapter. I'm happy to chat about it here because these two conversations do kind of bleed together a little bit. So Egwene asks, who's the other person? Is it Kari? Is it someone? Is it someone? And Moraine basically isn't going to say who the second person is. She's basically like, I said too much. Don't worry about it. That conversation's over.
Okay.
So there is that hint, but we don't yet know who the other person is.
So it could easily be one of these boys, and there we have balance, male, female, so on and so forth. Okay, that's where my mind went when reading it. But I think, and I'm certainly not trying to correct you, but I think she even says, like, don't worry about her right now. So it made me think, oh, it is Kari or it's another her or something like that. But I think you're right that what should really be taken away from that is she's just dismissing it. It's like, it's not time. And she has that line elsewhere: I will tell you some things, but I can't tell you some other things because you have to learn things before those things. And I thought that worked really well, both as like how you educate people and also as a kind of hand wavy, like, that's a second half of the book revelation, which, all these authors need to have that in their tool bag.
Well, and I really like how well Moraine manages those conversations, right? She seems to be very deliberate in what she's saying when, right? She's kind of like, it almost feels like, how, I'm sure you understand this more than I do, right? If you've ever hung out with like a very young child, for me, it's like nieces and nephews. For you, I'm sure it's your children, right? And it's like, you say stop, and then if they don't stop, they're going to like ratchet it up a little more until you like actually are like, no, this is done. That I feel like is Moraine's relationship with like Rand and Matt and Perrin in these chapters. Is it's like, first, no, I'm not going to answer that question. Let me explain to you why. And then like 3 times later in the next chapter, she's like, no, I'll just kill you. Like it escalates a little bit.
Well, and that relates to one of my notes is, more and more, I'm growing skeptical of Moraine, because there's a lot of, I'm doing this for your own good. You just have to trust me. And so the whirlpool that you mentioned is a moment that stuck out more to to Rand. I kind of understood that. It's like, we're in imminent danger. I'm just going to sink these idiots ferry and pay them for it. Right. And so like, if light side, dark side is as simple as the old Knights of the Republic morality, I'm like, oh, you balanced it out. Like, you paid for it. Like, it's become an inconvenience, not a like life destroying incident of that. So, but there is that tinge of darkness that Rand senses there. And to me, the one that stood out was talking about the spell put on the horses, which they said if left to their own devices, these horses would just keep running. And then the moment they stopped, they would just die. Like, they wouldn't feel the exhaustion. And that's kind of really dark, if, as a thing. And this other hint that that also was done to the boys and the party, right? That the party had a similar spell, and done at this level, they just want an extra night's sleep. But again, consent with magic and all those things, right? In our D&D group, we have, we always kind of overemphasize how it often says with somebody's consent, you may do X. And we always dramatically ask for that consent. But like to see this power just being done with that tinge of darkness concerned me. So I think I left, especially this chapter 12, more skeptical of Moraine than I had been.
Yeah, and in fact, I think very early in the chapter, we miss the first part of the conversation. That's one thing I actually love that Robert Jordan does a few times in these couple chapters, is we hear the second half or the first half of a conversation and not the other, just because Rand wasn't paying attention. But early on in the chapter, there's actually a moment where you can kind of deduce that Lan was asking Moraine, kind of, what do we do if this guy tries to stiff us? Are you going to be willing to use the power? Are you going to do anything? And Moraine's response is, he'll remember too much as it is if I stand out in his thoughts. And then she kind of trails off when she notices that other people are listening. So like, not only is there this tension between how she's responding to what are, really reasonable questions from the boys in a lot of cases, but we're also then seeing her very actively trying not to be noticed, including in the next chapter, using an assumed name when they arrive in town.
Well, and I want to couple that also with how as they are asking some of those questions, one of the responses at one point is like, look, you've trusted me. You can ask what you want, but I'm going to do my methods. Like you don't get to second guess them, right? Like it seemed to me the line was, she's okay with them asking questions about what she's done, but when they question whether that was the right choice or whether they should have taken a different path, I think that's Tom in particular makes that question, right? She really is not putting up with that. So it is this kind of like, I'm in charge, I'm in control. If you want me to get the job done, that's kind of the deal. And that, yes, that seems sinister. That seems suspicious.
Yeah, and I think this is what I love about Moraine as a character, and kind of what I was like implying Daryl Sweet might have been getting at with the backward side saddle thing very indirectly, is like Moraine seems to be doing all good things, at least as far as we've made it so far in this book series, but she doesn't seem like a great character, right? Or not a great person, right? She's a great character, but maybe not the best human, right? She seems, of anyone we've seen so far, the most willing to sacrifice people, to sacrifice, the two rivers, to do whatever she needs to do to accomplish what she's doing. And as we mentioned with like Tam talking to Rand, there's been a little bit of people just taking her on faith when she's saying things about what her intentions are. And this is definitely going to be tension that I think we kind of come back to repeatedly throughout this book.
Well, in the way the horses on the cover are light and dark, and then we automatically assume the light is not tainted by the dark. Yes. Sorry, go on.
No, I was actually just going to mention, we had kind of started this, I think good, useful conversation at the beginning with with Egwene and Moraine, and kind of looped our way back around to Moraine. So why don't we finish with something from the Saidar Saidin conversation that I was curious about, which was we get this scene where Egwene is trying to make the stone glow, right? Moraine makes it glow twice, and then Egwene gets like the faint little glow at the end to prove that she can channel. And the description of how she kind of reaches towards the source is described as emptying one's mind, as only having one thing in your thoughts, as focusing really directly on something. And this to me immediately just screams Buddhism and meditation techniques, right? So if we're talking about Moraine and kind of the art fitting how she's being portrayed in the book, we also see, if we're thinking about like Eastern versus Western, we were talking with Lan's Armor, another example of Eastern philosophy kind of making its way into the way that people are thinking about magic and the spirituality of the world that we're kind of living in.
Yeah, that is very prominent in Buddhism. I don't know why I'm just making your point back at you. Sorry, my mind is going. But the point you're making, that again, we have to be recognizing this as Eastern as much as Western, is a refreshing take on fantasy worlds, right?
Yeah.
And I think my my maybe not so limited experience in fantasy as we've been exploring this season, it does seem like there's a major movement on right now for people from marginalized communities to get to create their fantasy worlds, if that's N.K. Jemisin or Marlon James doing big African fantasies, or Rebecca Roanhorse is doing a kind of Native American fantasy series that's gaining a lot of popularity right now. And I think it is, again, Robert Jordan being ahead of the curve, right? Like, and I don't know a lot about him personally, and you can make cases for, that somebody from these traditions should get to write their own mythologies and their own fantasy. But I think it's admirable to think of somebody writing when he wrote that was like, no, you silly Americans, let's get out of just thinking of a Eurocentric version of medieval fantasy, and let's really think much more about what we could have, kind of merging these traditions. It also sounds a little like George Lucas to me, right? Like the
Yeah.
Force and Yoda and so on. So that's really appealing as well. Or maybe that's all that their genius was just pulling before everybody
Yeah.
else realized you could start pulling from over there.
Well, and I think another really good example of this comes in the same conversation between Moraine and Egwene, where we see, Robert Jordan is doing really interesting things with gender in this section, thinking about like the male side of things being tainted, as opposed to, we're used to Christian mythology where the original sin was female, sort of thing, right? But on top of that, the one thing that in the 90s was totally reasonable, normal thing, no big deal, but nowadays is potentially problematic for the show and for fandom. This is a world that is explicitly based on a gender binary, right? And that feels a little off in the 2020s nowadays. I'm curious whether that pinged for you at all as you were reading that.
I think, this is my own narrow-mindedness, is that I wasn't as concerned with that because it felt so familiar, right? Like, right. And I'm somebody who struggles hard to make sure I respect people's pronouns, and that especially when I'm teaching, I never try to dead name someone or any of those actions. And yet when it's kind of simplistic, it's so much easier to just like, oh yeah, that's familiar. That's right. Not a problem. Very much like, I actually thinking of Star Wars as light side, dark side is hugely problematic, because when we just write somebody off as you're either a good guy or a bad guy, we ignore or erase a lot of behaviors. And so kind of similarly here, you get both of those two things mixed together. It's like, let's just erase all difference and assume they belong there. But along those lines, I did catch this detail correct, that if there's a boy who exhibits some of the power, they're killed. Is that part of that conversation?
So according to Moraine, one of two things happens to men who can channel.
Okay.
Either they go insane and kill themselves, or this group that we haven't heard of before, the Red Aja, tracks them down. And the word that's used, I believe, in the chapter is, and they are gentled.
Okay.
We don't know quite what that means yet, but that's the verb that is thrown around.
I certainly went to mafia, sleeping with the fishes type things, being gentled. Okay. And I wrote that down as well, that now we have sects within the Aes Sedai, that there's the Red Aja, and then we meet another one in the next chapter as well. Right?
Oh, did we? I missed that when I was
the Children of the Light.
Those are not Aes Sedai. Those are people who want to murder Aes Sedai.
Okay. All right. Well, let's save that conversation there. So, but again, so far the Aes Sedai had felt like a monolithic, let's just get to them and they'll protect us. And now it's like, oh, okay, there are different sects, different interpretations of the power and what to do in response to the power. That intrigued me and made me interested. I'm making a lot of Star Wars references. Excuse me, that's who I am. My wife would also say, please stop making Star Wars references.
No, I will never say that.
But this feels very much like where a lot of Star Wars fandom ended with the midi-chlorians. Like the midi-chlorians make you susceptible to have the power, but you actually do still need to train and to channel that power. And so I thought Egwene being told she can be an Aes Sedai, but will need help, will need
Yeah.
mentorship and tutelage. And certainly we see that Moraine is interested in being that person, and but maybe not long term, right? Like
Yeah.
I'll help you on the path, but you're gonna need like sustained study. It seemed like Egwene signed on right away. Like, yeah,
Yeah.
that's I get to be the special one. I get to be beyond my two rivers. She sounded all in.
Yeah, we talked in previous episodes about how we kind of loved that Rand is a really reluctant protagonist. And I think we see in this chapter that both Perrin and Mat kind of fall into that category, right? They are not super excited to be going on adventures. They're kind of, there because it keeps them alive. Egwene is the opposite. Egwene is like, let's do it. Awesome. She's in, all in. And I
Yeah.
will say, I love Egwene. She is one of my favorite characters in this series. Like, I just love how she's like gung ho. I'm in. I'm 16. Let's kill some Trollocs. Let's channel the one power. Let's do it. Like, that's
Well, and
fantastic.
she has that great moment in today's reading. Again, I don't know why these two chapters are blurring together to me more than other times, but when she just is exasperated, it's just like, men, like you live
Yeah.
your lives wishing for adventures, and then all you're talking about is going back home, or what you'll say when you get back home, or how soon. And that was a really wonderful character moment where you're like,
Yeah.
yeah, she's awesome and she gets it, and she's really the one who's ready for this. The others seem to be a bit all talk. Well, the only other thing I had written down, and I think you caught me a few minutes ago looking in my book distractedly, I wrote down Lan defines the internet, which is just an awesome note to make, given
Yep.
that his name is Lan. But he says, well, when what they do is hidden, men sometimes deal with strangers in ways they wouldn't if there were other eyes to see. And quickest to harm a stranger are the soonest to think a stranger will harm them. I was like, oh, he figured out the internet. Like, that's the
Yep.
whole thing. Like,
That's
so
amazing.
I enjoyed that moment, obviously in reference to that early kind of robbery
Yeah.
confrontation, and certainly fun. So, all right, anything else for this piece?
I had one last, just very, very quick thing. When we read the original prologue, Dragon Mount, we had a list of terms that we were excited to kind of get some detail about and find some things out about. We're not quite there, but in the prologue, we did hear about an object called the Rod of Tamerlane. And in this chapter, Egwene is told by Moraine that she may one day become the Amerlin seat. So it's clear that there's some sort of linguistic connection there, even if they're not exactly the same. So we're getting some hints at that 3,000-year-old stuff coming back around a little bit. That being said, Chapter 13, Choices, basically gives us a week in the life of making your way to Baerlon. We begin with Lan training the boys in how to use different weapons and being impressed with them being able to use the bows as well as they can. Egwene gives up the braid that she had only recently been given in the Two Rivers and basically gets in a fight with Rand about it. Following that, Mat and Perrin begin to discuss whether or not they should leave this behind, whether it's worth going. And this is where we had the discussion we talked about before, where more or less Moraine says, you can come with me or you can die. Those are pretty much your two options. After that, we do get a scene where Egwene is talking to Moraine about the balance between male and female channelers and the different types of channeling that can be done with air and fire and water and those sorts of things. We then arrive at Baerlon. The boys are blown away by the size of the city. Tom is like, this isn't really even a city. We get the fake names from Moraine and Lan. And then finally, we get a couple of important pieces of detail. One is that we find out that the Children of Light are camped outside of the city. And we learn that the Children of Light are some sort of force that hates, it is said, dark friends as much as they hate Aes Sedai. The other thing that we learn is we learn a little bit from Tom about the prophecies of the dragon, what he calls the Cariathan cycle. And we learn that one of the key signs that the dragon has been reborn will be that there is this fortress called the Stone of Tyr, and it will fall to the people of the dragon. But it said that the Stone of Tyr cannot fall until someone touches the sword that is not a sword, or the sword that cannot be touched. But Rand asked the very reasonable question, how can you get in to touch the sword without the thing falling? And how can the thing fall without you getting in to touch the sword? And Tom's answer is just like, I don't know, prophecies that would be easy don't work. End of
uh
chapter.
yeah, and there's a lot in that. Like you said, this
Yeah.
is definitely just a very rapid widening of all this mythology in this world. So a couple initial thoughts. When they mentioned the city beforehand, not knowing what to expect, I was really curious to see what kind of city we would be talking about here. Like it could be like tall crystal structures or
Right.
anything, or mushrooms or anything. So when it turned out to be a little just like, oh, it's just like a lot of log cabins essentially.
Right.
A good fence and still pretty primitive. Sounded more like colonial America, for example, than it does a rich fantasy city or Emerald City or something like that. So
Yeah.
so I think I felt the same as, I guess that was Tom. He's like, this is barely a city. So
Right.
but all of that worked really well as character beats, that these boys are wide-eyed and ready to see the whole world. They're the tourist in New York City staring up at how tall the skyscrapers are instead of just walking down the sidewalk, even though this is not New York City. And then I think in the moment I liked from kind of the first part of the chapter, I was really intrigued by the combat training that
Yeah.
Land sees it as part of his job to get them ready, because it will be part of the success of this trip, of this journey, is whether they're prepared to actually fight with these weapons they carry around.
Yeah.
What was most interesting to me there, though, is you brought up the mental state thing from the last chapter, and he says very similar language, like empty your mind, think about that. And Rand says like, oh right, it's the flame and the void, and expects that will make him like the A+ student, like, yes, of course, you teach the class now. And he only gets like a strange look in reply,
Yeah.
like, what? And it wasn't like, this is a familiar thing and how do you know that? It was very much like, no, weirdo, like, just do the thing, is how I interpreted it anyway. So
well, the thing that I love about that scene is that the only description that we get of Land's reaction is it is an unreadable look. It's literally just Rand like shrugging. I have no idea what that meant. And so we as readers don't get to know what the look
all right
is.
And interesting that I filled it in a little bit,
Yeah.
with my own probably imposter syndrome or something. I don't know. I'll talk to my therapist later. So, but yes, I thought that was really interesting, especially because I know that impulse of like, I want to show I'm better than
Yeah.
everybody, and you are not. Yeah.
Well, and I love that we get this idea that kind of like the way that Lan is teaching him how to become a good swordsman, or teaching any of them how to use the weapons that they have, is very similar to the thing that Tam taught him, but not exactly the same. Right. And I remember when we talked about the flame and the void, we kind of talked about like, this seems like, kind of Eastern philosophy. It seems kind of meditative, but it also feels weird to be like, let's burn away all of our emotions. And so it's interesting to see Lan kind of preaching some of the pieces of that flame and void, but not necessarily the entire metaphor, which we kind of felt was a little flawed in terms of how it portrayed how you want to be thinking and feeling.
Yeah. And again, if I'm thinking of larger mythologies about like combat and fighting, like, it is often, your wife is the expert on Tai Chi and martial arts, so would be much better in this conversation, but it feels very in line with that still, right? Like that you're not going to act on the emotion, and yet burning the emotion, bottling it, that's the wrong impulse as well. So it's like a healthier version, a better wellspring of that same type of energy. And then, we get this growing conflict between Rand and Egwene. And I think what struck me about that conflict is it just felt very real, right?
Yeah.
Again, this is probably better for my therapist, but I will say I was at a party with a bunch of high school friends this weekend. I'm at the age we're all turning 40. So there's just endless birthday parties where we just look at each other and like, we're all old. That's the end of the story. Um, but there was this way in which seeing some of those people reminded me like, you got into fights back then about stupid stuff. I have a guy I never spoke to again because I thought Attack of the Clones was better than Spider-Man 1 and he thought Spider-Man 1 and we never spoke to this day. And it's like that is the stupidest type of thing, but it's like it all feels so big. And so this Rand Egwene conflict was like exactly that layered together, right? There's a little bit of jealousy there. I thought I was a special one. Now you're the special one. You're taking out your braid, you're changing, you're doing that. And also just this kind of this maturing, right? Like you're
Yeah.
just growing up, and some of growing up is realizing, oh, I don't belong on the same path as the people who happen to be born geographically near me and thereby attended the same high school or what have you,
Yeah.
right? And so in that growing up, it's like you're growing apart and it's only natural. And then you throw in boy girl stuff, of course, with this pair as well, that it's jealousy, but it's also like, well, when I don't want anybody telling you you can be big
Right.
and in the world, you're supposed to be mine. And all of that is just my rambling to say I think it was really well drawn, that it felt like these were real people and it tapped into emotions that were, I assume, familiar to anybody who has ever been a high schooler or ever matured around a group of friends.
Yeah, this felt like a very 16-year-old fight in that it was a fight about hair that was actually about something else, right? This is
Yeah.
basically the big fight that's been bubbling behind the scenes ever since Egwene said, no, I'm probably not going to marry you. I'm going to move out of town and be a doctor, right? And
Yeah.
so the fact that this is like a big fight about someone's hair, but really it's about this relationship that's crumbling and
Mm-hmm.
her, rejecting the culture that Rand sees as his own. And he's the reluctant guy who doesn't want to leave town. And she's like, I'm thrilled, make me an Aes Sedai, it's over.
Yeah.
I think that feels very real to have those, kind of deep emotions you're talking about, but have them almost, be a facade for the real fight that's happening here.
Yeah, I mean, and it's not totally revolutionary to see that in pop culture or in
Yeah.
even fantasy, but it's really well done here. So compliments to Robert Jordan.
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, to me, I think we've hit on the big moments from my perspective on the travel half of this sequence. Was there anything else in this chapter that you were like during the kind of, week on the road that you wanted to make sure we discussed?
Only, we have the eavesdropping scene where Rand listens in on the private lessons. The private lessons have been extensive. I really liked the note that Aes Sedai are no better than others. They also make mistakes, right? That
Yeah.
don't think of them as shining, sterling forces for absolute good. And, again, that's better than light side, dark side, because
Yeah.
that is like people are complicated and they are real and they make mistakes. And, I think to me that's, and again, this is also a maturing thing, right? That I do think we need mythologies that remind us of that, because it's so easy to say I'm not a racist because I don't say the N word. It's like, no, but here are the many, insensitive or rude things you do that are actually racist and much more important than the fact you don't say the N word, perhaps. So, it also, gosh, this goes back to Last Jedi fights, but it feels to me that there was a time in our country when we definitely needed heroes who were pure good and pure evil, so we could identify that. And that's a lot of where Star Wars came from in the wake of like Watergate. Like, let's just get back to there could be good guys, and you want to be like the good guys. This feels more modern to me, even though it's not really, or it's kind of barely on our timeline here. Where no, let's actually mature beyond that and recognize that only a child sees people as absolutely good or absolutely bad, and in reality people are very complicated and we have to embrace all that. So I appreciated this kind of heads up, and again it reinforced the misgivings I'd had about Moraine, and I guess maybe not reinforced, but imagined them or reshaped them to be like, oh, well, maybe she's not trying to be sinister, but she's the first to admit that she's doing the best she can and not necessarily doing the right thing.
Yeah, and this is what I think is really interesting about this series in the context of kind of fantasy generally is I tend to see kind of the pre-Wheel of Time world as being very kind of black and white. That's where we get, Lord of the Rings and Narnia and a lot of these kind of like mythological good versus evil sort of stories. And then I see Wheel of Time almost as like the gateway drug into gray fantasy, right? Because
Mm.
it combined true evil in the form of a dark one who's here to destroy everything, along with all of this like moral political gray, right? There are factions in the Aes Sedai. If you ask, are the Aes Sedai going to save us? The answer is no. They're just women like any other women. There are good ones, there are bad ones. You need to know who to trust and who not to. And so to me, like if Game of Thrones is pure gray fantasy. There are very few true good guys and very few true bad guys. And,
Mm.
Lord of the Rings is the opposite of that. This is the series that brings those two pieces together and tells you there are true evils and there are true goods, but that doesn't mean there isn't gray in between. And I think that's a really interesting place to sit as a series, both chronologically and almost philosophically.
Yeah, and I know these are problematic categories. I really want to graft those onto the generations, right? It's like the baby
Yeah.
boomers where the Tolkien, that doesn't quite work, but that's who read Tolkien, right?
Right.
And then Gen X looking towards Wheel of Time, and then
Yeah.
millennials and perhaps younger reading and watching Game of Thrones. That kind of works with how I see those generations, at least in their broad strokes, anyway.
Yeah, that sounds about right. And as we're now thinking about kind of like gray characters, this is actually a really good lead in to a question that I had for you about something that I briefly touched on in the overview, which is that one of kind of the two major pieces of information we get in Berlan is that there are children of the light camped outside of town, right? And these are described, the phrase that I really liked is they hate Aes Sedai as much as dark friends, right? So they both see themselves as forces for good. They hate dark friends, but they also believe that there's something wrong with Aes Sedai. So I was curious if you kind of keyed in on that, or if you had any kind of thoughts, or I love your semi-accurate predictions, if there's anything about that for Children of the Light.
So my notes I wrote down about the Children of the Light, I have Aes Sedai police question mark, and I think I would use that. Kind of the details you're emphasizing. It's not like police to control them, but very much a force that is tired of it all, right?
Right.
And like Game of Thrones, since you just referenced it, had a lot of that too. It's like the actual people were like, we don't care about these nobles. Like we
Yeah.
die for one and then we die for the other. Like, we want to like just raise our crops and walk down a road without getting harassed or what have you. So I noted they were present outside the city, and some were not. Some were allowed in at a time, but they weren't welcomed into the city. They weren't,
Yeah.
the powers that be there, and they were reacting to the dragon in Galdron, and there was already a battle there, is what the rumors are. There's
Yes.
We don't get an absolute confirmation, but that fits with what you're saying as well too. It's like they just want this to be not happening essentially,
Yeah.
right? And so there's already been a battle. We're just trying to like mellow everybody out as a part of that. It seems to me that because Moraine is afraid of them, I naturally sided against them. So if you're
Right.
asking me like predictions, they seem sinister, they seem bad. And yet at the same time, I understand like if your world is defined by, black and white fighting back and forth, Saidin and Saidar fighting for who controls the universe, then like yeah, get rid of it all, wipe it all out. Now I'm being Kylo Ren, right?
Right.
Like, but leave it all behind. Let the past die. Kill it if you have to. But I totally get that as an emotion, and that is to me often that's the apathetic voter too, right? It's
Right.
like it all sucks, everybody's awful, I'm just not going to try anymore. And like you can't, right? You can't give into that emotion is how I deeply feel personally, even
Right.
though it often is the most logical choice.
Yeah, and I think that actually that metaphor of like the apathetic voter kind of tapped into how I read the line that you had already referenced of like we have, the dragon is in Gaelden and there's been a battle fought and all sorts of things are happening. And here the children of the light are, stirring up trouble in this town because people are afraid of the dragon, right? And so it's that same thing of like there are horrible things going on somewhere in the world, and so if they must be bad everywhere, come on, join our cause kind of thing, right? Like it feels very like, misdirected, straw man kind of argument, just the way that that's constructed.
Yeah, and I'm really tempted to like link that to modern policing and
Right.
such, but I will avoid doing all that because I think we'd like to keep this mostly kind of in the escapism of fantasy and to a certain degree. But it does feel like as we look around the world today, we're seeing a lot of bad actors acting on the chaos and the disillusionment. And so to again see that, these are not new ideas, right? I mean, it's been around on the wheel before. And here it comes again and kind of shaping our culture and shaping our impressions of things. Obviously, there was a lot more skepticism of police in earlier periods of American history. Maybe that so not exactly we don't have to say more or less necessarily, I guess, but that these same skepticisms are coming around at a time because in a world of gray, how much easier is it not to try to understand, right?
Yeah.
Not to try to figure out who's right and who's wrong, but just reject it all.
Well, and I think that that's a really interesting point in light of the other big, world building exposition drop that we get, which is about the prophecies of the dragon, right? Because we now know that we are not only in a world where, there's, this power that's driving the universe and there's this conflict, between the dark and the light and all of this. But at the same time, we now also know that prophecies are things and that there is something, foredestined or foreknown. And I feel like that could almost add to the sort of apathy or the sort of like, let's just end it all sort of feeling of like, if the world is destined, then like, let's just let destiny happen. Like, why are we worried about all this Gaelden stuff?
Yeah, and I mean, when I read a prophecy in a fantasy book, it's like, oh, okay, so that's going to happen, right? Like,
Right.
they're all very clever, and it's like, how can these two things happen? And these are Rand's questions. It's like, well, they'll find a way. Like, that's just why they're here. Is that the unthinkable time will actually come, and we are living in the time of heroes. So that was my main reaction to that. And that's not to say that's completely dismissive, right? It's just like you have to lay that groundwork somehow so that we in the audience understand how big the big events are when they come to pass, or when they almost come to pass and fail slightly, or what have you. We have to know that, and that's what that moment felt primarily like to me. To know there are already people of the dragon, though, present, right? There are people who are taking on that name,
Yeah.
and that they are named in the prophecy. That feels like, okay, we are in the quote unquote end times of this universe. We're in the time of prophecy.
Yeah.
And but then I'm like, well, this is book 1 of 13, so where's that going to bring us? And again, I think I'm anticipating the fact that because this is so long, we are going to be through a lot of generations of this world, these baseless predictions. No, I'm prophesizing, that's what I'm doing. I can't imagine that we're on this quest and with this group of people for the full 13 books. It has to be bigger than that. So could it be that we see this prophecy come to a close at the end of this book, or maybe at the end of the 3rd book, because maybe it's a trilogy, who knows? And then we move on to the next spin of the wheel or something. Would make more sense to me.
Man, you are so spoiler free. You don't even know the name of the 3rd book to confirm whether it might or might not have anything to do
I'm
with?
not gonna look.
Okay, excellent.
I know it's my mass market paperback has the list of all of them, but I'm like not letting my eyes focus on the text. I'm gonna stay it. I want to stay the course. I have to be the ignorant one. So that's the whole shtick. So if I read the back of the book, we're screwed.
Fair enough. Yeah, I just think that this is, to me, this is something that I think Robert Jordan does very well, is you're kind of describing the possible outcomes of a prophecy. And it's like either it kind of happens the way we expect and we get kind of the like big revelation, or it happens in some way that we didn't expect. And so we get that like interesting moment of, irony and figuring out what did it actually mean. Or, something goes on that, we think proves that the prophecy hasn't been fulfilled or won't be fulfilled. And we've got to figure out what in the world that means, right? Those are kind of the possible outcomes, kind of the same way you were describing. And I think one thing that I really appreciate about the prophecies in this series is that they all feel as if they're constructed. Actually, this is a chess term that I've been hearing a lot because I've been watching a lot of professional chess. This is a weird thing that I do with my life, but they're playing for three outcomes, right? It's not as if they're playing a game where it's like either a draw or one person wins. Like all of these prophecies that he writes feel like all of the possible, scenarios are out there. They feel contradictory enough that maybe they're impossible. They feel kind of general enough that they could be fulfilled, but they also feel, kind of they have that flexibility of like, we could think that this is fulfilled and it actually isn't, or something that we didn't expect to fulfill a prophecy would. And I think Jordan kind of hits that line really well. Whereas, and this is my like bias against J.R.R. Tolkien showing, but like, I just cannot read the Silmarillion and any of the like so-called foreshadowing. Cause I'm like, no, this is just, you're telling the story again, right? I feel like Jordan doesn't give away what's going to happen in the prophecy in the way that it's very easy to sometimes do.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and I take all that and I completely agree, at least with my limited exposure to the same topic. And it makes me think of Nostradamus and how like everybody's like, he was right. He predicted 9/11. And you're like, he did? Let me look it up. And it's like, someday a bird will fly past a smoke plume. And you're like, what? That could be anything, right? Like, so while what you're saying is, easy in a controlled universe where one author is creating all that, it makes me think like, well, whatever happens, we will read it into the prophecy. And that's what a prophecy is, right? Like, so yeah.
And let me also, I think this is a good time because it's very, very early in the podcast. I can just say it and then never have to mention it again. And there's no possibility of spoilers. This is our first prophecy. Let me just say, Robert Jordan was the kind of author who knew everything in advance. He planned it out. He's wonderful. His plan clearly changed around book 3. So there are definitely a few prophecies in the early books and a few details that kind of like fade into obscurity a little bit. I think we get some indirect answers to every prophecy, but just be aware the like intricate knot of every prophecy perfectly lines up starts in about a book and a half, just so y'all know.
I love that. I mean, again, as a Star Wars fan, I love how George Lucas always claims everything was planned out, and it was clearly not. My favorite example, though, is always, I think I actually referenced this in a previous episode, Stephen King with the Dark Tower books. He's like, yeah, I had this all planned from when I was 20. And then like the accident he was in his,
is in book 5
is in the books. You're like, what? You didn't play it. There's another fantasy series I've read all of. So look, I'm mapping it out. So that's the entirety of my notes. As I alluded to in my first comment of the episode, I wrote down fun, but a lot as for these episodes. Like I enjoyed it. There was nothing I was really, upset about, but actually there was a time when I was reading and my kids were getting crazy and I turned to my wife and was like, I just need to go upstairs and read like these 6 more pages, like without splitting my attention and without looking away for a moment here and there. Cause it did feel like you really had to pay attention to get these names and map out this mythology in your head. And, I trust Robert Jordan that, whatever I can retain will be helpful, but I won't miss out. Things that are important will be re-explained as a good author does.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something I think Robert Jordan is really gifted at. I would not worry too much about like not catching things the first time. You'll get hammered over the head sometimes too often with the same imagery. Yeah, I mean, I think I had the same general impression, and I will say, I don't want to give away too much about my overall impressions, things like that, because I don't want to, spoil the way you think about the rest of the series. This chunk of the book is the closest to homework the Wheel of Time gets for most of the series to me. It's a little dense on the world building. It's a little light on the really exciting plot moments or really wonderful character moments. I think you're identifying exactly what the problems are. It's a little dense, right?
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that. It's just a little dense. And before we kind of, sign off, that was kind of everything that I had for the chapter. I had one quick question for you, because we had talked about, we had actually talked before we started recording. I said, like, look, are we far enough in the series that I would be able to say, here are some of my favorite characters, here's who I really enjoy, and not be spoiling, like, well, that character's not going to die on page 73, right? Like, now we kind of know who the, main cast of characters are. I love Egwene. I already mentioned that. I also love Perrin. I want to wait to talk a bit about my love of Perrin for a few chapters from now when we get some really cool stuff that I enjoy. I'm just curious for you, from your perspective, we're almost 200 pages into this book. Obviously, Rand is the character whose head we've been in the most. Is there any other character who's really jumped out at you as like you're intrigued by, or obviously you don't know a favorite this early, but just someone who is like, who would your first impression rose be for those of you who love The Bachelor like I do?
So I'm gonna answer the question with the inverse first. Like, I find myself drifting away from some characters. Like,
Okay.
Lan is just lame. Like, I'm tired of him. Like he's the heavy, right? He's he's there to provide a function, but he's not actually doing much for it. Perrin and Matt feel like Merry and Pippin to me at this point.
That's
They're
fair.
like, hey, they're also here, and I assume book 3 will really be where they meet the Ents or whatever, like where they become more relevant. So I would probably agree with Egwene. I'm somebody who is often intrigued by that kind of young female heroine. I was just playing one of our favorite board games last night, Marvel Champions, and I got to be Riri Williams, Ironheart, and
Oh my God, I ordered that deck. I'm so excited.
oh, it's so good, and I was having so much fun. I'm like, I just love this kind of character that, I think when done right, it's like, when done poorly, it's manic pixie dream girl, but actual good spunk like Veronica Mars or Kamala Khan in Ms. Marvel. I think they're nailing.
For sure.
So there's a lot of this type out there, and only fair because we've had the male version as our only heroes for 60 years. So I do find myself drawn to Egwene. A few times tonight you reminded me they're all 16, and I think I realized in my head I'm not picturing that, right?
So just to be careful, Egwene is
Okay.
16, the boys are 18.
Or 18, but I'm not even picturing teenagers. I think my head, maybe this is the age I'm at. I'm like defaulting to picturing like late 20s, early 30s. So it is, and I'm not faulting the writing. I think I just have to remember that these are young people, and that will probably make young people type decisions, or like you say, have a young people fight about hair. So I'm going to take Egwene at this moment. I'm going to say open to liking Perrin, but not that attached now. I did like the kind of Power Rangers, like I have a bow and I have an axe and I have a sword. That all felt like we get to collect the action figures. Although, there are none, or maybe there are at this point. I don't know.
If there are, I need to start collecting those action figures.
I mean, Amazon hasn't hopped on the merchandising the way HBO just destroyed the world with Game of Thrones merchandise. Like,
sure.
I feel like I'm still seeing season 1 Game of Thrones merchandise in stores. Like, don't you want to be the mother of dragons? I'm like, no, like nobody wants to be here now. My son, well, this is now off topic. My son is 7 and he just finished first grade. And in his first grade class, there was a young girl named Daenerys. And I was counting backwards in my head. I'm like, yeah, 7 years ago, I would have named my kid Daenerys. Yeah. I would not be happy about having a kid named Daenerys now. And I'm sure she's a wonderful child. I'm sure her parents are great. That is not casting aspersions, but just recognizing how quickly those things turn and change. So open to other heroes and open to ditching the ones I like currently.
Yeah, that's my approach to anything. I am willing to ditch anyone anytime. So I think we've kind of covered the main, topic areas that we really wanted to for this week. So next week we're going to be covering two chapters: Chapter 14, "The Stag and the Lion," and Chapter 15, "Strangers and Friends." And Greg, I'm going to put you on the spot for the perfect outro today. Nail it.
Well, I would just say I thought Stag and Lion and Strangers and Friends would have been great alternative titles for this podcast. Ones I could have understood. I would have been the stag and you could have been the lion. So I will say with always leave them laughing. Thank you for joining us on our adventure. We're so excited that everybody's giving us a chance. I think our recorded outro, we'll say it in a minute, but please share us around. Even if you're not liking us, just throw the link on your Twitter and on your Facebook. We want to grow this community as much as we can. So there you go. A laugh and a desperate plea from a broken man to therapy. Let's go. So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend the show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.